Hi, it's Pat Pattison with Pat Pattison's Best of California, and I'm very excited to be interviewing somebody that's going to tell us all about the history of women in the gold rush. Andrea Anderson, good to have you here.
Thank you, Pat. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, first of all, I have to acknowledge something about you. Do you know what it is?
I don't.
Think about your name and think about my name.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
We are in a very elite club of people that have double names. Pete
Yeah.
Peterson, Robert Robertson. I'm assuming had you been a boy, you'd be Andy Anderson, right?
Probably. Yeah.
So AAPP, it's a thing. I always notice it when I find
Yeah.
people. Good to be here with you. So you have an amazing history. Tell me a little bit about, first of all, where you are. You're in Sonora, and
Yeah.
and just how you got interested in this whole world through your family.
Well, I live in Sonora, California, born and raised, and that's where Wood Creek runs through Sonora, California. Woods Creek is where one of the more prolific gold discoveries were in
Okay.
1951 in California. And I actually have traced my family back to my four times great grandmother, who was from Nicaragua. Her name was Harriet Novice. In the obituaries in the newspapers, they called her Old Lady Novice, and they considered her one of the pioneering women of the area during the gold rush.
So right there in the area you're still living in.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I mean,
So,
it's a little bit over. I'm in Sonora and she was
yeah,
in Ptolemy Hill, but
yeah,
there's lots of records and stuff that showed her in Sonora also at the time.
yeah. Well, and those city definitions weren't that
No.
thought
Yeah,
out
no, it
then.
was just all gold country back then.
Yeah, it was all woods and in terms of when you kind of and I should say I didn't say in the introduction you have a podcast that you do. Tell us about the podcast and
I
where we can get
do.
that.
I have a podcast and a book under the same name, and
Great.
it's
Okay.
called Queens of the Mines. And the book and the first season of the podcast focus on 10 women's stories
Okay.
who were in California, either who had first come to California during the gold rush days, or in the case of some indigenous women who were already here.
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
I tried to find, different stories to represent all the different people that were here at the time. And a lot of them are stories that we haven't really heard or have been highlighted in the past. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I went looking for those, trying to figure out what it was like for my own family in the time,
Isn't that
the women in my
fascinating?
family.
Wow. And that's, I mean, I don't know how unique it is up there to have these gold rush families, be still in the area. But in terms of your own family and how did you grow up with these stories or did you kind
No,
of
I
get
didn't
in?
know about these stories until I started doing the research.
You didn't have, I've had the same experience. My family moved to Los Angeles in the 1880s, and it was just a blank slate until I started digging. So
Yeah.
I think part of it is we have so much access to these records now. It was just too much work before.
Absolutely. Yeah, I got really into genealogy and started doing all that stuff. And I was using those skills to help me research these women who I was looking up, and then started finding my own stories as well.
Isn't that great? What was the first story you found? I mean, what tweaked the interest to dig deeper?
So my favorite story and the first story I found was of a woman named Josefa Sahovia. And
Wow.
she was she was living in Downeyville.
That's another double name, I think. I'm not
Yeah.
sure, but that sounds
No, Josefa Sahovia,
okay.
But so she was living in Downeyville, and she had come from Sonora, Mexico, with the original group of settling miners that had come up during the gold rush.
Yeah.
And she actually came through here through Sonora. There's some legends of her in Sonora, some of our underground,
Wow.
literally underground tunnels and systems underneath our town. She has a part of that. but she had gone to Downeyville and was working as a barmaid, and she was maybe one of 25 women of a town of maybe 5,000 men, and she was a Mexican woman, which was even more rare at the time there, and she was actually abused by one of the men in the town and took action and took revenge and murdered him. Wow. And was hung within an hour of doing so. Wow. In the town. And it's kind of just this crazy story that shows how little, how there was little value put on women and people of color at the time. And I mean, to think to murder, you have 5,000 men, you only have 25 women, and you're going to hang one of those women, it's just, it's outrageous. And
no, I'm sure. Yeah,
the whole state quickly condemned the act, and people got in trouble, but there's a lot of mystery to the story too. And I don't even know if this is appropriate to talk about, but her skull was dug up about 20 years later and used by a secret club in California to drink out of for rituals.
That's amazing.
And then legend has it, maybe a year after I wrote the story and told the story, I found out about a year later that the legend is that skull is buried in Sonora. Underneath our streets.
Not surprising that there would be many, many stories about what you might dig up out there in the gold country.
Right, yeah.
And so this amazing story, just to put us in historic perspective, 1849 obviously is the discovery of gold in California. California had been Spanish, owned by the Spanish.
Yeah.
Who came in and took it
right up until the gold rush too.
Took it from the indigenous people. There's just I think in terms at least, and I've read quite a bit about this era of just how, from the Native Americans into the Spanish era, which was really a placeholder where they built the missions to just kind of keep everybody else out, really, and ran the missions. And then the Mexican independence and taking over this area. And then President Polk and the Mexican-American War, which was kind of a land grab, not to get too controversial here.
Half of the country, yeah.
Yeah, and Fremont came in, and so this amazing, who knows if it was a coincidence or not, the fact that gold was discovered almost immediately after.
Yeah, like a month later, yeah.
But anyway, we won't get into those controversies.
I do get into those controversies in the book, though. I do get into
Okay, well, that's good to know. That's good to know. And where can people get the book, just so I have that on tape?
Well, the easiest way for someone to get it is to order it off of Amazon.
Amazon, okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, it's on Amazon, Queens of the Mines. There is a Kindle version, a paperback version, a hardback, and within the next month, the audiobook will be available.
I look forward to getting it. And so this period of time, you literally have millions of people, hundreds of thousands, millions, come swarming into California from all parts of the world.
America's largest migration.
Is it really?
Yeah.
And so I think people sometimes that are here in California, think of this as, this is the United States and it's been ever thus. But one of the reasons California has so much diversity is that it was founded in the gold rush. And it was people coming from, South America, people coming from Asia, it was this huge migration of people.
Yeah. And around that time, the indigenous, sorry, my coffee pot just went off. Around the time the indigenous were speaking up to, I think, 90 different languages in California at that time. And then Spanish was right there next. So when California, I'm sure you know this, but I don't know if everyone knows, when California was made a state, it was actually written in the first constitution in California that all laws must be printed in Spanish and English.
I remember, yeah.
Spanish was the first language, so California was made to be bilingual from the very beginning,
Yeah. And the other little piece about that too, here again, I'm not an exact historian, is that California became a state faster than any state's ever become a state. It was fast tracked in while all these other territories have been sitting there waiting. And oh no, we got gold. That's a state.
Oh yeah, I mean it was within weeks of the gold rush. I mean it all happened all at once. So then the following year, so it would be 1851. It was California's the first Independence Day where California was included in the United States, and that's the day that story happened with Josefa Sahovia.
Yeah. So back to these amazing pioneer women. Who's another story you can tell us about, Andrea?
Well, there's more on the coming in on the wagon train side. There's Luzena Wilson. So she came in. She was the second white woman to arrive in Sacramento during the gold rush. And Luzena Wilson had the domestic skills that were not out here with all the men. The men did not want to cook. They didn't want to clean. They didn't want to, they didn't have those skills. That's not what they were doing at the time.
Let me dig.
Yeah. So this woman, Luzena, she shows up in Sacramento, and the first man to see her cooking at her campfire for her family, she had come with her husband, her brother, his family, some of her boys. He offered her $5 for one biscuit. I mean, we're looking at over $100, what that would be comparable to today for one biscuit, and then doubled the money just for a loaf of bread. And at the time, her husband, Mason, he was not finding any gold. He was having no luck. He was bummed out because he had hauled his whole family across the country to do this. And he was worried to come home after being gone on a few-day excursion to tell his wife that he had no luck. But when he got home, he realized there's 30 men sitting down there being fed, and they all paid a couple bucks a person. She's making good money. Yeah. And that was her fourth seating of the day. So, he was trying with his pan, but she was there with her pan. And
that's great.
Making it big. And just the determination and what these women have gone through. I think her hotels and restaurants burnt down maybe 2 or 3 times in the process, but she always just picked it right up and got it right back to where it was. And she has this quote. Let me see if I can say it right. And I try to remember that when things like this happened to me. It was, the nest egg was gone, but the bird who laid the egg, the will and power to work was still there.
Oh, and wow.
So she, the nest was gone, but she still had the bird. So she just keeps laying those eggs.
Isn't that great?
And I just think it's a neat story. And it showed how the value of a woman at that time, even though they weren't here.
I wanted to cut in and just say I'm interviewing Andrea Anderson, who has a book, Queens of the Mines, and a podcast, Queens of the Mines. Now, where do we get the podcast, Andrea?
The podcast is available anywhere you can listen to podcasts. So Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify. I think you can even go on YouTube, and it's on YouTube. Okay, great. Because this is such a fascinating history. I mean, the proportion of women to men, is it even calculable? Is it less than 10%? What we can calculate is the proportion of white women to men. Okay. Because they were not documenting women of color. They weren't documenting the indigenous, the Mexican women, any black women who had came in. So they were looking at the whole state of California at the very beginning of the gold rush, 3% white women.
3%, okay.
And that grew over the entire gold rush to 8%.
Wow. And of course, one of the dynamics of the gold rush, you mentioned Sonora had 85,000 people at one point, or that was it Downeyville or Sonora?
Sonora. Sonora and Columbia. Yeah, we were almost the capital.
Yeah, and right, Columbia was almost the capital. And is it that big now?
Well, I mean, it's that big now, but
barely.
In comparison, it is a bigger. The numbers have grown for sure, but just in comparison, if you look at that number at that time in San Francisco, there was probably 800 people.
Yeah. So
when we had getting closer to hundreds of thousands, San Francisco had 800.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, it was all booming up there. And then Sacramento, that happened. And then that's where they ended up putting the capital. But it was almost the capital here.
Yeah, right. I know that story. That's an amazing story because we've done a segment. We'll do a link to our segment about Columbia. Do that someday. Tell us some specific steps you took on your genealogy, like websites, Ancestry. What was helpful?
I started with Ancestry.com just because I was just doing the generalized idea, and then I actually started taking lots of courses to learn all that. But I'll tell you right now, the best tool, if I could give anyone just one tool to get familiar with and look into, it is that findagrave.com.
Isn't that amazing? Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
It's so good. And I actually use it for certain episodes where I kind of do an audio tour where you put your headphones in starting at the gate.
Right.
Of certain gold rush, and I tell you where to go, and then I tell you the stories of the people that are actually buried there.
What a great idea.
And I've done that with Find a Grave. And you could search names, you could search by cemetery, you could search by town and area. And
it gives you dates. The big deal is it gives you dates.
Yep. Yeah. And what I like to do when I go on to a certain cemetery, I do the sort. So I sort it out to the people who were buried there first. Okay. So I'm not looking through all. I like to go as far back as I can.
Doing the pioneers, yeah.
And that's actually where the book starts, is in one of our local cemeteries.
Oh, okay, great. And then what other things did you find it helpful? Find a Grave, Ancestry, anything else you could give us tips on?
Just our local newspaper archives, because we did have a newspaper here at that time. We had the Sonora Herald, which was, interestingly enough, the person who owned it, he was an abolitionist from back east. Yeah. And him and his wife came here. So they were printing the newspaper and doing everything, but secretly they were also printing out all of this abolition handbills and information and getting that sent out, but nobody knew that was all being done here in Sonora.
And so tell us, we're going to wrap up here a little bit. Tell us another favorite story about an uplifting story. Is there one about a woman?
I know. I'm sorry.
No, these are great. Don't get me wrong.
I know. I did try to find women, people who had such an impact, but.
Well, and just like we're talking about, you can't change history. If it turned out bad, it turned out bad,
Yeah. Well, there's Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was California's first Black millionaire.
Okay.
She was a freed slave, came to California, and started helping other freed Black people who were moving to California to work and be free, started getting them those jobs too. Wow. And pretty soon they all started listening to the business tips and started learning how to really make money and how to do these moves. And so all this,
the Women's Investment Club, the original,
right? So they'd all come back to Mary Ellen and tell her what the dirt was, the tea that they heard that day. And so she started putting all her money into the right spots, and she ended up Charley Parkhurst, who was actually a stagecoach driver, born a woman, decided, you don't have the opportunities as a woman that a man would receive in the Wild West, so decided to live their life as a man. And
heard that story.
The most famous stagecoach drivers. We have Madame Moustache, who was a French 21 dealer, Viet Un, dealing blackjack, and French woman with a beautiful woman with a mustache. but she was not only the first female professional gambler, but she was the first professional gambler in California.
And if somebody wanted to come up and visit some of the things that you're talking about right now, come to Sonora, come to Columbia, where are things that people can actually go see?
Well, Columbia, California is the best one in my opinion.
Preserved, yeah.
It's preserved beautifully. That's my stomping grounds, and that's where everyone there is all family. Columbia, yeah, but Columbia, and then Nevada City.
Nevada City, yeah. And we've been up there, and yeah, we'll do more. So, Andrea, this has been so great. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Pat.
And we'll show your information, where to get your book, how to get the podcast, and more to follow with Andrea. We'll be up to see her.
All right. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
All right. Sounds good.